The moving truck pulled away from 1247 Oak Street on a Tuesday morning, leaving behind a man who looked like he could blend into any crowd. Jake Miller stood on his new front porch watching the truck disappear around the corner. At 34 years old, he had the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. Average height, brown hair that he kept short but not military short, and clothes that came from regular stores. Nothing about him screamed Special Forces operative. That was exactly how he wanted it. Jake had spent the last 15 years of his life in places most people couldn't pronounce, doing things he could never talk about at dinner parties. He was a Navy SEAL, and until 6 months ago that had been his entire identity. But after his last deployment, something inside him had shifted. The constant adrenaline, the life or death decisions, the weight of responsibility for his team's safety, it had all caught up with him. When his commanding officer offered him a choice between another tour or an honorable discharge, Jake surprised everyone, including himself, by choosing the discharge. Now he stood in suburbia, surrounded by white picket fences and minivans, wondering if he'd made the right choice. The house was perfect for his needs. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, and most importantly, it sat on a corner lot with clear sight lines in all directions. Old habits died hard, and Jake found himself automatically assessing every building's tactical advantages. The basement would make an excellent safe room with a few modifications. The large oak tree in the backyard provided cover but could also hide threats. The neighborhood was quiet enough that unusual sounds would stand out, but busy enough that he wouldn't be the subject of constant attention. His first interaction with the neighbors happened the very next day. An elderly woman named Betty from across the street brought over a casserole and enough questions to fill a police report. She wanted to know about his job, his family, why he'd moved to their neighborhood, and whether he was planning to paint his shutters a different color. Jake had prepared for this. He'd practiced his cover story until it sounded natural. "I work in security consulting," he told Betty, accepting the casserole with a smile that felt rusty from lack of use. "Mostly corporate stuff. Pretty boring, actually." It wasn't technically a lie. Since leaving the Navy, he had started doing some consulting work for private security firms. They paid well for his expertise, and the work was simple compared to what he was used to. But Betty didn't need to know about the years he'd spent jumping out of helicopters in hostile territory, or the medals locked in a box in his closet. "Security consulting," Betty repeated, like she was tasting the words. "That sounds exciting. Trust me, it's mostly sitting in offices looking at computer screens," Jake said. "But it pays the bills." Betty seemed satisfied with this explanation, though Jake caught her glancing at his truck, a well-maintained but unremarkable Ford pickup, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. He made a mental note to be more careful about the small details that might give him away. Over the next few weeks, Jake settled into a routine that felt strange after years of unpredictable military schedules. He woke up at 5:30 every morning, not because he had to, but because his body wouldn't let him sleep later. He'd go for a run through the neighborhood, taking different routes each day while telling himself it was for variety, not reconnaissance. But his eyes automatically cataloged everything: which houses had security systems, which residents left for work at what times, where the blind spots were in the street layout. After his run, he'd work on the house. Jake threw himself into home improvement projects with the same intensity he'd once reserved for mission planning. He installed new locks on all the doors, high-quality deadbolts that would take serious effort to breach. He upgraded the windows in the basement and first floor, replacing the standard glass with reinforced versions that looked identical, but were much harder to break. To any observer, he just looked like a new homeowner making his house more secure. They had no idea he was turning it into a fortress. The neighbors began to warm up to him. Tom from next door appreciated that Jake kept his lawn in military-precise condition. The young couple across the street, Dan and Lisa, invited him to a barbecue where he spent most of the evening listening to complaints about the homeowners association and nodding at appropriate intervals. Jake found their problems almost quaint. They worried about grass height regulations and mailbox colors, while he still woke up some nights reaching for weapons that weren't there. But there were moments when civilian life felt almost normal, like when he was fixing Betty's leaky faucet and she insisted on making him lunch afterward, talking about her late husband's military service in Vietnam, or when Dan asked for help moving furniture, and they spent the afternoon talking about football and weekend plans like regular neighbors. These interactions felt like practice for a role he wasn't sure he'd ever master completely. The hardest part was the silence. After years of constant communication with his team, the quiet of suburban evenings felt oppressive. Jake filled the silence with projects, with television shows he'd missed during deployments, with long phone calls to his sister who lived across the country. She was the only family member who knew the full extent of what he'd done in the military, and even she didn't know all of it. "You sound different," she told him during one of their weekly calls. "More relaxed." Jake wasn't sure if that was true. He felt like he was constantly waiting for something to happen, for the other shoe to drop. In the military, there was always another mission, another threat, another problem to solve. Civilian life felt like being permanently on standby, and he wasn't sure if the feeling would ever go away. 3 months into his new life, Jake had established himself as the quiet, helpful neighbor who kept to himself, but was always willing to lend a hand. He'd helped Tom install a new garage door, fixed Betty's computer, and even agreed to water Dan and Lisa's plants while they were on vacation. To everyone on Oak Street, he was just Jake Miller, the security consultant who lived in the corner house. None of them suspected that beneath his ordinary exterior was a man trained to kill with his bare hands, who could disappear into any environment, who had spent years protecting his country in ways that would never make the evening news. And that was exactly how Jake wanted to keep it. He thought he'd found the perfect place to blend in and start over. He had no idea that his new quiet neighborhood was about to become anything but peaceful. Jake first noticed them on a Thursday morning during his usual run. 2 men in matching polo shirts and khakis were walking through the neighborhood with clipboards, stopping at various houses and taking notes. They had the look of officials, clean-cut, serious expressions, and an air of authority that made people step aside on the sidewalk. But something about them set off alarm bells in Jake's head. Maybe it was the way they moved. Too casual for real authority figures, but too deliberate for door-to-door salesmen. Or maybe it was their van, a white cargo vehicle with magnetic signs that looked freshly applied. The signs read Oakwood Community Standards Division in professional-looking letters. But Jake had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know that their HOA was called Oak Street Residents Association, not Oakwood Community Standards. He filed the observation away and continued his run, but made a mental note to keep an eye on these so-called officials. Over the next week, the men appeared 3 more times. Each visit followed the same pattern. They'd park their van at different locations around the neighborhood, walk house to house with their clipboards, and spend an unusual amount of time looking at windows, driveways, and security systems. Jake watched from his kitchen window as they photographed the side of Tom's house, where he kept his expensive lawn equipment. He saw them counting the number of cars in driveways and making detailed notes about each property. Most concerning was their interest in his own house. During their second visit, they'd stood across the street for nearly 10 minutes, one man pointing at different parts of Jake's property, while the other wrote furiously on his clipboard. They'd taken several photos of his truck, his front door, and even his mailbox. When Jake stepped onto his porch to get a better look, they'd quickly moved on to the next house. Real HOA officials didn't need to case properties like that. Jake had dealt with enough intelligence-gathering operations to recognize surveillance when he saw it. On Friday evening, Jake decided to do some reconnaissance of his own. He walked over to Betty's house under the pretense of returning a tool he'd borrowed. Betty loved neighborhood gossip, and if anyone knew what was going on, it would be her. "Oh, those men with the clipboards?" Betty said when Jake asked about them. "They came by Wednesday. Said they were doing some kind of property compliance survey for the HOA. Wanted to know about my security system and whether I kept any valuables in the house." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "Did they ask to come inside?" "They tried to, but I don't let strangers in my house. My late husband always said never trust anyone who shows up unannounced, even if they look official." Betty's eyes sharpened. "Why? Did they bother you too?" "Just curious," Jake said, but his mind was racing. Real HOA officials wouldn't ask about valuables or security systems. Those were exactly the kinds of questions criminals asked when planning break-ins. The next morning, Jake called the Oak Street Residents Association office. The woman who answered sounded confused when he described the men with clipboards. "We haven't authorized any property surveys," she said. "Our annual inspection isn't until October, and we always send written notice first." "Are you sure they said they were from our HOA?" Jake thanked her and hung up, his suspicions confirmed. These weren't HOA officials at all. He spent the weekend quietly observing the neighborhood, noting which houses the fake officials had shown the most interest in. The pattern became clear. They were targeting homes with expensive cars in the driveways, visible electronics through windows, or obvious security upgrades that suggested the owners had something worth protecting. On Sunday afternoon, Jake saw them again. This time they were being more bold. Instead of just walking by houses, they were approaching front doors and having lengthy conversations with residents. Jake watched through his upstairs window as they spent nearly 20 minutes talking to Dan and Lisa across the street. When they left, Lisa looked upset and Dan kept shaking his head. Jake waited until the van disappeared around the corner, then walked across the street. He found Dan in his garage, aggressively organizing tools that didn't need organizing. "Everything okay?" Jake asked. Dan looked up, frustration clear on his face. "Those HOA guys are saying we need to register all our electronics and any firearms with their office for community safety purposes. They wanted a complete inventory of everything valuable in our house. Said if we don't comply, we could face fines or even forced sale of our property." Jake felt his blood pressure spike. This was definitely not legitimate HOA business. "Did they show you any official paperwork?" They had badges and everything looked official, but something felt off. Lisa's pretty shaken up about it. They were really pushy, kept insisting they needed to come inside to verify our compliance status. "Good thing you didn't let them in," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Did they say when they'd be back?" "Tomorrow morning. They want our compliance paperwork filled out by then." Dan pulled a crumpled form from his pocket. "This whole thing feels like a scam, but what if it's real? What if we get in trouble with the HOA?" Jake looked at the form. It was professionally printed, asking for detailed information about security systems, valuable items, daily schedules, and whether residents owned firearms. At the bottom, it requested permission for periodic compliance inspections of the property. "This is definitely a scam," Jake said, handing the form back. "Real HOA officials don't need to know about your personal property or daily schedule, and they definitely don't need to inspect the inside of your house." Dan's relief was visible. "I knew something was wrong, but they seemed so official, and they knew details about the neighborhood. They even mentioned Betty's garden competition and Tom's new garage door. That information was easy enough to gather by simply observing the neighborhood, but it would make them seem more legitimate to unsuspecting residents." Jake realized these criminals were more sophisticated than typical scammers. "They'd done their homework. Have you called the police?" Jake asked. "Not yet. I wanted to check with some other neighbors first, see if anyone else was dealing with this." Jake made a decision. "I'll talk to a few people, see what I can find out. In the meantime, don't give them any information, and definitely don't let them in your house." As Jake walked back to his own property, his mind was already working through the possibilities. These weren't random criminals. They were organized, patient, and thorough. They'd been casing the neighborhood for over a week, gathering intelligence on multiple targets. The fake HOA story was clever because it gave them a reason to ask invasive questions and demand access to homes, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd chosen to operate in a neighborhood where a former Navy SEAL happened to live. Jake had spent years tracking down enemies who were a lot smarter and better equipped than a couple of small-time criminals. And unlike his neighbors, he wasn't going to be fooled by fake badges and official-looking paperwork. That evening, Jake began his own surveillance operation. He set up a camera in his upstairs window with a clear view of the street, programmed to record any movement around the white van's usual parking spots. He also started a detailed log of the fake officials' activities, noting their patterns and timing. If these criminals thought they could intimidate his neighbors and rob his new community, they were about to learn a very painful lesson about choosing the wrong neighborhood to mess with. The knock on Jake's door came at exactly 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been expecting it for 3 days, ever since he'd started asking neighbors about their encounters with the fake HOA officials. Word traveled fast in a small community, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the criminals decided to deal with the person who was asking too many questions. Jake looked through his window and saw them standing on his front porch. The same two men he'd been watching for over a week, but today they looked different. More tense, more focused. The older one, a heavy-set man with graying temples, kept glancing around like he expected trouble. The younger one, tall and thin with nervous energy, had positioned himself slightly to the side, a classic flanking position. Jake took a deep breath and opened the door, but kept the security chain engaged. "Can I help you, Mr. Miller?" The older man stepped forward with practiced authority. "I'm Officer Rodriguez from the Oakwood Community Standards Division. This is my partner, Officer Wilson. We need to speak with you about some compliance issues regarding your property." Jake studied their badges. They looked real enough at first glance, but he'd seen enough fake credentials during his military service to spot the tells. The lamination was slightly off, the fonts didn't quite match official government standards, and the badge numbers were sequential, a rookie mistake that real agencies never made. "I wasn't aware we had any compliance issues," Jake said calmly. "What seems to be the problem?" Officer Rodriguez, if that was really his name, pulled out a clipboard thick with official-looking forms. "We've received reports about potential firearms violations on your property. According to our records, you haven't registered any weapons with our office as required by the new community safety ordinances." Jake almost smiled. They'd done their homework on the neighborhood, but they'd made a crucial error in targeting him. While most residents might be intimidated by official-sounding language about firearms regulations, Jake knew exactly what the laws were. He'd had to navigate weapons regulations in dozens of countries, and he was certain that no HOA in America had the authority to require firearms registration. "I wasn't aware of any such ordinance," Jake said. "Could I see the specific regulation you're referring to?" The younger man, Wilson, shifted impatiently. "Sir, we don't have time for lengthy discussions. We need to conduct an immediate inspection of your property to ensure compliance with community safety standards. Please step aside and allow us to enter." Now Jake's training kicked in. Wilson's tone had shifted from official to demanding, and his body language had become more aggressive. The man's right hand kept drifting toward his jacket pocket, while Rodriguez had moved closer to the doorframe. These weren't officials conducting a routine inspection. They were criminals preparing to force entry into his home. "I'm afraid I can't allow that without proper documentation," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "I'll need to see a warrant or court order before anyone enters my property." Rodriguez's facade began to crack. "Mr. Miller, you seem to be misunderstanding the situation. We have full authority under HOA regulations to inspect any property in this community. Refusing to comply can result in immediate action against your residency status." Jake noticed several things at once. Rodriguez's accent had slipped slightly, revealing traces of a regional dialect that didn't match his supposed official position. Wilson was now clearly reaching for something in his jacket. And most importantly, a third man had appeared near the side of Jake's house, trying to stay out of sight but visible from Jake's peripheral vision. This wasn't a scam anymore. This was a coordinated assault. "Gentlemen," Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm going to need you to step back from my door and provide proper identification before we continue this conversation." Wilson's patience snapped completely. "Look, we're trying to be nice here, but you're making this difficult. We know you've got valuable items in there, and we know you've been asking questions around the neighborhood. Time to cooperate or things are going to get complicated." The mask was off now. Rodriguez shot his partner an angry look. They'd revealed their true intentions too early. But Wilson was already committed to the aggressive approach. "Here's what's going to happen," Wilson continued, pulling a knife from his jacket pocket. "You're going to invite us inside for a friendly chat about your compliance issues. We'll take a look around, make sure everything's in order, and then we'll be on our way. Nobody gets hurt, and this stays between us." Jake assessed the tactical situation in microseconds. 3 attackers, one with a visible weapon, positioned to control his escape routes. They'd chosen his house specifically because they thought he lived alone and wouldn't be able to defend himself effectively. They had no idea they'd just threatened a man who'd spent 15 years learning how to neutralize exactly this type of threat. "I understand your position," Jake said calmly, "but I'm afraid I can't accommodate your request." Rodriguez stepped forward aggressively. "You don't have a choice here, buddy. We know you're alone. We know your neighbors aren't home, and we know you don't want any trouble. Just open the door and this will all be over quickly." Jake's military training had taught him to recognize the moment when violence became inevitable. These men had committed to their course of action, revealed their criminal intent, and positioned themselves for an assault. They weren't going to walk away, and they weren't going to be reasoned with. The decision tree was simple. Submit to the attack and hope they didn't kill him after robbing his house. or take control of the situation before they could execute their plan. For a Navy SEAL, it wasn't really a choice at all. "Gentlemen," Jake said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used when briefing his team before dangerous missions. "I think you've made a serious error in judgment." Wilson laughed harshly. "Oh, really? And what makes you think that?" Jake looked directly into Wilson's eyes and for the first time, let his true nature show through his carefully maintained civilian facade. "Because you just threatened the wrong person." Wilson's confident expression flickered as something in Jake's demeanor triggered his survival instincts. But it was too late to back down now. The younger man raised his knife and stepped toward the door, while Rodriguez moved to force the security chain. Jake had given them every opportunity to walk away. They'd chosen violence instead. Now they were about to learn why that was a mistake they'd regret for the rest of their lives, however long that turned out to be. The moment Wilson lunged forward with the knife, 15 years of Navy SEAL training took control of Jake's body. Time seemed to slow down as his mind automatically shifted into combat mode, processing threats and calculating responses with the precision of a computer. Jake slammed the door shut and immediately disengaged the security chain, not to keep the attackers out, but to remove the barrier that would limit his own movement when he went on the offensive. In the same motion, he grabbed the tactical flashlight he kept near the entrance. It wasn't just any flashlight. It was a military-grade aluminum device that doubled as an impact weapon. The door exploded inward as Rodriguez threw his full weight against it. He'd expected to find Jake backing away in fear. Instead, he ran directly into 180 pounds of trained warrior who had just switched from civilian mode to full combat effectiveness. Jake's first strike was surgical. The tactical flashlight caught Rodriguez in the solar plexus with enough force to completely empty his lungs and drop him to his knees. Before Rodriguez could even process what had happened, Jake had already moved on to the next threat. Wilson came through the doorway with his knife raised, expecting to find Jake retreating further into the house. What he found instead was empty air where Jake had been standing a split second earlier. Jake had sidestepped behind the door, using the same movement techniques that had kept him alive in countless close-quarters combat situations overseas. Wilson's momentum carried him past Jake's position, and Jake struck with the efficiency of someone who had practiced these movements thousands of times. His left hand trapped Wilson's knife arm, while his right delivered a precise blow to the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor as Wilson screamed in pain from what was definitely a broken bone. Jake spun Wilson around and applied a sleeper hold that rendered the younger man unconscious in under 4 seconds. He lowered Wilson's limp body to the floor, then turned his attention back to Rodriguez, who was still gasping for air and trying to figure out how the situation had gone so wrong so quickly. "Stay down," Jake commanded in the voice he'd used to control panicked civilians in war zones. "Keep your hands where I can see them." But Rodriguez wasn't finished yet. As Jake secured Wilson's knife, Rodriguez managed to pull a gun from his jacket pocket, a small revolver that he pointed at Jake with shaking hands. "Don't move." Rodriguez wheezed, still struggling to breathe properly. "I'll shoot." Jake looked at the gun with the same calm assessment he'd used to evaluate any piece of equipment. Rodriguez was holding it wrong. His finger wasn't properly positioned on the trigger, and his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't have hit a target 3 feet away. More importantly, Rodriguez had made the classic mistake of getting too close to his target while distracted by his own pain and surprise. "You really don't want to do that," Jake said calmly, taking a small step to his left. "Shut up. Just shut up and get on the ground." Rodriguez was panicking now, which made him exponentially more dangerous. Not because he was more skilled, but because panicked people made stupid decisions. Jake needed to end this before Rodriguez accidentally pulled the trigger. Jake's training had covered this exact scenario dozens of times. Disarming an armed opponent at close range was all about timing, positioning, and using the attacker's own reactions against them. Rodriguez was focused entirely on the gun, which meant he wasn't paying attention to Jake's feet. Jake took another small step, and Rodriguez instinctively adjusted his aim to track the movement. At the exact moment Rodriguez's attention was focused on realigning his shot, Jake moved. The gun disarm took less than 2 seconds. Jake stepped inside Rodriguez's line of fire while simultaneously grabbing the weapon and twisting Rodriguez's wrist in a direction it wasn't designed to go. Rodriguez screamed as his wrist snapped. and the gun fell into Jake's hands. Jake quickly secured the weapon and applied pressure to Rodriguez's shoulder that dropped him face first onto the floor. Within moments, both attackers were neutralized and under control. But Jake's tactical assessment wasn't complete yet. He'd seen 3 men, which meant there was still one threat unaccounted for. His training screamed at him never to assume the immediate threats were the only threats. Jake moved to his front window and spotted the 3rd attacker trying to sneak around to the back of the house. This one was smarter than his partners. He'd stayed back when things went wrong and was now attempting to flank Jake's position, or possibly escape altogether. Jake had a decision to make. He could call the police immediately and hope they arrived before the 3rd man got away, or he could ensure that all 3 criminals were captured. His neighbors deserved to know that the threat was completely eliminated, not partially resolved. Jake made his choice. He secured Rodriguez and Wilson with zip ties he kept in his emergency kit, then moved through his house with the practiced silence of someone who had cleared buildings in hostile territory. The 3rd attacker was trying to force entry through Jake's back door, apparently unaware that his partners had already been neutralized. Jake positioned himself behind the kitchen counter and waited. When the back door opened and the 3rd man entered cautiously, Jake was ready. "Turn around slowly and put your hands where I can see them," Jake commanded. The 3rd man, younger than the other 2 and clearly inexperienced, spun around with a gun in his hand. But his reaction was driven by panic rather than training, and his movement was clumsy and telegraphed. Jake was already moving before the man completed his turn. A single precise strike to the wrist sent the gun flying across the kitchen, and a follow-up move that Jake had learned from his martial arts training put the 3rd attacker on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made resistance impossible. "Stay down," Jake ordered, applying just enough pressure to make it clear that movement would result in significant pain. Within 5 minutes of their initial assault, all 3 criminals were secured on Jake's living room floor, conscious but completely immobilized. Jake stood over them, barely breathing hard, his civilian clothes unruffled except for a small tear in his shirt sleeve. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "This is Jake Miller at 1247 Oak Street. I need police and ambulances. I have 3 men here who attempted to break into my home. 2 have broken bones and may need medical attention. All 3 are secured and no longer a threat." As he waited for the authorities to arrive, Jake looked down at the 3 men who had thought they were targeting an easy victim. Rodriguez was staring at him with a mixture of pain and disbelief, clearly trying to understand how their carefully planned home invasion had turned into their own capture, in less time than it took to make a cup of coffee. "Who are you?" Rodriguez gasped through his pain. Jake considered the question for a moment. These men had seen him as just another suburban homeowner, someone they could intimidate and rob without consequence. They'd never imagined that their target might be someone with the skills and experience to turn their own violence against them. "I'm just your neighbor," Jake said calmly, "but you picked the wrong house." In the distance, Jake could hear sirens approaching. Soon the police would arrive, and he'd have to explain how he'd single-handedly neutralized 3 armed attackers without suffering so much as a scratch. That conversation was going to be interesting, especially when they started asking questions about his background and training. But for now, Jake was content to stand guard over the 3 criminals and wait for backup to arrive. After months of quiet suburban life, it felt strangely familiar to be back in tactical mode, controlling a secured area and waiting for extraction. Some skills, he reflected, you never really lost. The first police car arrived within 6 minutes, followed quickly by 2 more patrol units and an ambulance. Jake watched through his front window as the quiet neighborhood suddenly became a crime scene, with red and blue lights reflecting off every house on the street. Neighbors began gathering on their porches and sidewalks, trying to understand what had happened at the home of their reserved neighbor. Detective Ray Parker was the first officer through Jake's front door. A 20-year veteran of the force, Parker had seen his share of home invasions, but the scene that greeted him was unlike anything in his experience. 3 grown men lay zip-tied on the floor, 2 with obvious injuries, all looking like they'd been through a professional training exercise rather than a street fight. "Mr. Miller?" Detective Parker looked around the immaculate living room, noting the lack of any signs of struggle except for the 3 subdued criminals. "I'm Detective Parker. Can you walk me through what happened here?" Jake gave a clear, factual account of the events, starting with his observations of the fake HOA officials over the past week and ending with the attempted home invasion. He spoke with the precise economical language of someone accustomed to giving briefings, though he carefully avoided any details that might reveal the extent of his training. So you're telling me that these three men, at least two of them armed, attempted to force entry into your home, and you subdued all of them by yourself without sustaining any injuries? Detective Parker's tone was professional, but Jake could hear the skepticism underneath. That's correct. Detective Parker looked at Rodriguez, who was being treated by paramedics for a broken wrist and possible concussion. And how exactly did you manage to disarm and subdue three attackers? Jake had prepared for this question during the minutes before the police arrived. I have some self-defense training. When they threatened me with weapons, I defended myself. It was technically true, though calling 15 years of Navy SEAL combat training some self-defense was like calling a nuclear submarine a boat. As the paramedics worked on the injured criminals, Jake overheard fragments of their conversation that filled in some crucial details. Wilson had a fractured wrist and 3 cracked ribs. Rodriguez had a broken wrist, bruised solar plexus, and was displaying signs of a concussion. The third attacker, who had identified himself as Carter, had a dislocated shoulder and multiple bruises but no serious injuries. Detective Parker interviewed each of the criminals separately. What emerged was a picture of a sophisticated operation that had been targeting upscale neighborhoods across 3 counties for the past 6 months. The fake HOA story was their latest evolution. Previous scams had involved posing as utility workers, city inspectors, and even federal agents. They've hit at least 15 houses that we know of, Detective Parker told Jake as the ambulance prepared to transport Wilson and Rodriguez to the hospital. Mostly grabbed electronics, jewelry, and cash. But this is the first time they specifically targeted firearms. Jake wasn't surprised. Illegal weapons were worth more on the black market than most household goods, and they were easier to transport and sell. The criminals had probably planned to use his house as a testing ground for expanding into weapons theft. What I don't understand, Detective Parker continued, is how you knew they were fake. Most people would have been fooled by their setup. Jake shrugged. Something felt off about them from the beginning. Real HOA officials don't usually ask about security systems or valuables, and they kept taking pictures of houses which seemed like surveillance rather than inspection. Detective Parker made notes, but Jake could see the wheels turning behind the detective's eyes. There was more to this story than Jake was telling, and Parker was experienced enough to recognize that fact. As the criminals were loaded into police cars and ambulances, neighbors began approaching Jake's house. Betty was the first to reach him, her face a mixture of concern and amazement. Jake, honey, are you all right? We heard shouting and then saw all the police cars. I'm fine, Betty, just some men who weren't who they claimed to be. Tom from next door arrived next, followed by Dan and Lisa from across the street. Word spread quickly through the small crowd that Jake had single-handedly stopped the same men who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for weeks. You mean those were the fake HOA guys? Dan asked incredulously. And you caught all 3 of them? Jake nodded, uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing that his neighbors deserved to know they were safe. How did you know they were fake? Lisa wanted to know. Jake found himself repeating the same explanation he'd given Detective Parker, emphasizing his suspicions about their behavior, rather than his ability to neutralize armed attackers. But he could see the questions in their eyes. How had their quiet, unassuming neighbor managed to defeat 3 criminals when most people would have been lucky to survive the encounter? Detective Parker returned as the crowd was dispersing. Mr. Miller, I need to ask you a few more questions. Your neighbors have been telling me that you seemed to know these men were criminals before today. Can you explain how you were so prepared for their attack? Jake realized that his surveillance activities had been more obvious to the neighborhood than he'd intended. I've been keeping an eye on them since they first appeared. Something about their behavior didn't seem right, so I started paying attention. And your combat training? Where did you learn to disarm multiple attackers? This was the question Jake had been dreading. His cover story about some self-defense training wasn't going to satisfy a detective who was looking at 3 professionally neutralized criminals. Jake made a decision. These people were his neighbors now, and they'd trusted him enough to accept him into their community. They deserved to know enough of the truth to understand why they were safe. I'm former military, Jake said simply. I served overseas for 15 years before moving here. Detective Parker's expression changed immediately. What branch? Navy. What was your job in the Navy? Jake hesitated for a moment, then decided that partial truth was better than continued deception. Special operations. Detective Parker nodded slowly, and Jake could see understanding dawning in the officer's eyes. Special operations covered a lot of territory, from explosive ordnance disposal to intelligence gathering. It didn't necessarily mean elite combat forces, but it explained Jake's tactical awareness and defensive capabilities. That explains a lot, Detective Parker said. Why didn't you mention your military background earlier? I don't usually talk about my service. I came here to start a civilian life, and most people don't need to know about my background. Detective Parker seemed satisfied with this explanation. Military veterans often preferred not to discuss their service, especially those who had served in special operations roles. The detective wrapped up his questioning and handed Jake a business card. If you think of anything else, give me a call. And Mr. Miller? Thank you. These guys have been a real problem for us, and you probably prevented them from hitting a lot more houses. As the police finished processing the scene and departed, Jake found himself standing on his front porch watching his neighborhood return to normal. The excitement was over. The criminals were in custody and life would go back to its regular rhythm. But things had changed. Betty waved at him from her garden with new respect in her eyes. Tom gave him a thumbs up from his driveway. Dan and Lisa smiled and waved from their front porch, no longer worried about fake officials threatening their home. Jake had wanted to blend into this community as just another civilian neighbor. Instead, he'd become the person everyone knew they could count on when trouble came calling. It wasn't the anonymous retirement he'd planned, but as he looked around at the peaceful neighborhood he'd helped protect, Jake realized it might be something better. He was home. And for the first time since leaving the military, that felt exactly right.